Hi guys, it's Lucy. Happy Lunar New Year. I wanted to make a video today on how to choose what to read next. And the idea for the video came about because as most of us have day jobs and limited time and resource in terms of energy left over at the end of the day, there's a staggering amount of new releases coming at us every single month, every single year, that I think it could be overwhelming for most of us to make a choice and know that it might be a good choice or have a very good chance of being a good choice. There are also a lot of recommendations and must-reads out there that I think give a lot of inspiration, but at the same time could add to this decision overload. So I put together some thoughts on do's and don'ts that represents my approach to how I choose what to read next. That kind of works for me. So I thought it might be interesting and wanted to share. I hope you enjoy, and let me know what you think and if you have any other strategies. This could be thought of as a strategy of how to choose, or perhaps even a personal book philosophy when I think about it a bit more, and you'll see why. So the first do of how I go about choosing books is browse. And this is browsing in person and browsing continuously and extensively. So where do I go browsing in person? The first place I would recommend the most is the library. And this is for a very obvious reason, it's that it's free. And if you're stuck at home, you could also use the app Libby on your phone. But for me, I like the paper feel, and I like opening books before checking them out or paying for them. So I still recommend the in-person visit if that's possible. The second place I would recommend is the Second-Hand Bookstore. And there are a couple of ones that I go to regularly, and the type of purchases that I make at secondhand bookstores tend to be more on the fiction side. And the reason is that I usually hone in on the authors that I'm very, very interested in and know that there is a high turnover of books. For example, Haruki Murakami. And a couple years ago, when I first started reading Stephen King, there were a lot of Stephen King books. So there's no need to really go to a new bookstore and look for these specific titles, unless I think maybe for gifting reasons. The third place obviously is the new bookstore, and it could be the chain bookstore or your favorite independent bookstores. So browsing extensively and continuously is what I preach, and I do this at all of these locales. And what I mean is looking at fiction, not going over not just the new releases, but everything on the back shelves, and not really having an aim. And once I do that, I usually just mosey over to the nature sections, the photography sections, the food, the travel, religion sometimes, history, of course, biographies. So there is some sort of serendipity. I believe that out of a place where so many ideas have accumulated, when you are being open in that way and walking around and picking up something, if there is something that resonates with you at that specific moment in time, it's as if the book has found you, or the author, the idea has found you, versus the other way around. So going with the intention of browsing, but not really having a particular idea of I want this specific book, is the approach that I generally go with. With modern technology, obviously, I do check reviews. So coming across a book or an idea, like say Japanese gardens, I might think, well, I'm not sure if I want to pay this much X amount of dollars for this book on Japanese gardens where this topic has been so much explored. So I will go home and look at all the relevant books on the same topic and check reviews on these to see which is the most highly reviewed. And this is just an example on a nonfiction work. And I did this with the book about periods that I read last year, and I would also do this about fiction works that I'm not familiar with as well, and especially translations and classics. With classics, there are very different editions that include different things. So it could be, it includes short stories and essays, or just one major novel, or an omnibus of this and that. So with translations, the other thing where you could have it might read very differently if it's coming from a different translator, and there could very well be a version that the critics and the audience agree on is a better version, or a more representative version, or a version that they just like better. And then this could be something new or something old. So you never know until you really start looking into something that seemed interesting. So you could come across something very interesting now and just go with it, which is totally fine. But also at the same time, it's also fine to take that title down in your phone and go home and do a little bit more research. And especially when it is involving a purchase. So I'm not a minimalist. This is not a minimalist channel, but I do believe that it's annoying to have bought something and have it sitting there, and it just reminds you of, if it's not something that is that you were very sure of, there's a little bit of guilt involved with that. So that leads me to a don't. So the second thing is, don't feel guilty. And this is not about consumers' regret. This is more about readers' regret, where you read something halfway and you lose interest, or you found something more interesting to read about. And I think that is totally okay. I do that all the time. I have a lot of books that are read a third of the way, halfway, and I just leave it there. And more often than not, I come back years later. So don't judge yourself in the day to day or week to week. I pick up books years later and I finish them, and I might go back, more often than not, reread from the beginning, and it would be like a completely new discovery. Maybe it wasn't the right time that I've started that book. And this is more often with classics, but I know that they are classics for a reason, so there is always a chance that I will go back to these type of books, or just doesn't have to be classics. But for me, overwhelmingly, I drop classics in the middle of reading them for some weird reason. So the next do, besides browse, that I jotted down is do listen to a friend. So this is similar to checking reviews on resources like Goodreads. If I hear from one friend that this title is good, and I hear a year later or half a year later that another friend, or just somebody I know, I always like to ask people for their book recommendations, and most of the time I don't follow them. But if there are repeat books from people that I come across, i.e. word of mouth recommendations, I put a really high value on that, because I know that people don't really have that much time to read a ton of books. So if somebody has put the time to read it through and remembered it and thought it was worthwhile to recommend, that's something worthwhile for me to at least check out. And usually those recommendations end up really well. So, and that leads me to a don't, which is don't listen to marketing or the masses. So this is excluding, what I mentioned, my friends or family or acquaintances that are, very sincere in our one-to-one conversation, saying, I read this book and this is very good. Right now I'm talking about all of the recommendations that are inundated to us week after week when the bookstores change their displays. The last don't that I would mention is that don't feel pressured. So don't feel pressured to walk out or check something out or buy anything, because if you don't feel like reading, why force yourself? It has to do with a certain motivation, I think, to want to be absorbed in a book, in an idea. I wouldn't, if it starts to become like an obligation, I think that's just unnecessary. So there are times where I don't read for a week, maybe 2 weeks, maybe even more. Like it could be a specific time in my school life or career that is just extra busy or extra stressful. I think ultimately reading is a journey. I think it's about discovery, discovering the world and our culture, and self-discovery in that process, and leading ultimately to self-expression. I think in recent days, it's starting to feel more like a fad, more akin to some sort of demented consumerism, potentially. And this is definitely not, I think, the right direction to go to. I think the only reason that one would ever read anything, almost, except for if you have to read something for school, or if you actually need to learn some sort of skill and it's a textbook and you just absolutely cannot skip something like that, it's going to help you in some sort of way. Excluding those really should be the vast majority of the reading that I do is out of pure interest. I hope that was interesting for people to listen to. Leave me a comment if you have any other strategies or comments about your own book philosophy. I think that would be really interesting for me to hear. Have a good day.